For more than 40,000 years, Canada has been home to Indigenous peoples with an estimated population of 2 million prior to European contact. As members of a settler society, it's important that we recognize the rich history and the current presence of Indigenous peoples who were here before us and who continue to be caretakers of this land today. 3 groups of Indigenous peoples recognized by the Constitution of Canada are Indian, Métis, and Inuit. Today in Canada, the term First Nations is generally preferred to the term Indian. There are more than 600 First Nations bands with their own unique cultures and over 60 different languages Indigenous to Canada. Speech-language pathologists treat people of all ages, diverse cultural backgrounds, and various geographical locations. Taking this into consideration, we believe it's important to bring awareness to Indigenous history in Canada, cultural values, and current issues to provide better care to Indigenous clients. We want to acknowledge that at the time of making this video, our team is made up of non-Indigenous individuals, which means that we aren't experts on these topics. Members of our team took the course Indigenous Canada from the University of Alberta, and we wanted to share this knowledge in relation to the field of speech therapy. To learn more, we recommend you check out these resources created by Indigenous individuals, which you can find links to in the description. Acknowledging the land on which we conduct our practice is a simple but important first step in creating a space that advocates for Indigenous peoples. It shows respect for, and brings an awareness to, the presence of Indigenous peoples in the past and today on the territories where we live and work. For example, Andalusia Speech Therapy has 2 clinics in Toronto that operate on the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. You can check out the website Native-Land.ca as a starting point to learn about the First Nations territories where you live. It's also beneficial when preparing a land acknowledgement to ask yourself the following questions. Why is this acknowledgement happening? What is your relationship to this territory? How did you come to be here? And how are you going to work to combat colonialism beyond this territory acknowledgement? It's important to remember that there is no singular Indigenous culture, but a common element among many Indigenous communities is that knowledge is traditionally passed down from generation to generation through storytelling. This comes in the form of lived experiences or teaching stories, sometimes referred to as myths or legends by non-Indigenous people. While stories can be forms of entertainment, they also contain important lessons about morality and are a way to pass on history and cultural knowledge to the next generation. Education is a process that extends through all 4 stages of life: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and maturity. Elders play an important role in passing on knowledge within Indigenous communities. There's no definitive age at which someone becomes an elder, but it's generally understood that they have lived through all stages of life, possess significant knowledge of traditional practices, and they have a strong connection to spirituality. When asked for advice, elders typically don't give direct answers or guidance. Instead, they usually share a story in order to encourage the other person to think for themselves. Some Indigenous communities take a holistic approach to a person's wellness that can be viewed as a series of concentric circles. The human being is at the center, with the social, cultural, and environmental at the outermost circle. When it comes to healthcare, the second circle represents the importance of mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being altogether. Therapists coming from a Western perspective may be providing a more limited approach. It's important in some Indigenous cultures for the whole person to be treated cohesively. While this is on the rise in speech therapy by collaborating with occupational therapists, physicians, psychologists, and more, for Indigenous cultures, this is already a core practice. When discussing treatment with Indigenous clients, recognize the benefits of an interdisciplinary approach to improving the person's well-being. In order to provide culturally sensitive and informed speech therapy to Indigenous clients, it's important to understand the harm done to these communities through colonization and the long-lasting impact that this has caused. From the very beginning, settlers' relationships with Indigenous people were founded in distrust and deception. Despite the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was supposed to prevent settlers from taking land as they pleased, European colonizers disregarded this and established themselves here. In 1876, the Indian Act was introduced, and throughout its 140 years of existence, some of its major effects include the concept of enfranchisement, meaning that someone would have to give up their Indian status if they wanted to become a Canadian citizen. Replacing the responsibilities of elders and women with a patriarchal system run by white men. Banning potlatch ceremonies where older generations would pass on important oral histories, values, and laws to younger generations. Banning traditional dance. Denying First Nations people the right to vote. Denying women's status, and so much more. Some of its policies are still in effect today. One of the most shameful acts committed by the Canadian government is the establishment of residential schools. It's important to remember that this is not buried deep in our past, but actually took place very recently, with the last school closing in 1996. Armed with the goal to kill the Indian in the child, children were taken from their homes and brought to these boarding schools for 10 months out of the year, many never returning to their families at all. They were forced to assimilate to Christian beliefs, forget their languages, and reject their cultural values. Many of these children were also physically or sexually abused, and over 4,000 children died from malnutrition, terrible sanitary conditions leading to tuberculosis, and other horrific acts. There was absolutely no respect for Indigenous lives, as countless deaths were unreported, many families still unsure about the fate of their loved ones today. At the time of making this video, the remains of over 1,000 children have been found buried in unmarked graves at residential schools across Canada.
This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. We all must put down our ignorance and accidental racism of not addressing the truth that this country has with Indigenous people.
More are expected to be uncovered since these remains were only from 4 schools, while the total number of residential schools was 139. These discoveries highlight the ongoing trauma that Indigenous communities face in the present day.
So that next morning we ran away. I went down the hill and got on the highway. We got a ride right away by a farmer. When he dropped us off and we started walking again, it started to rain. All of a sudden, that green station wagon pulled out behind us, and I knew who that was. That was the administrator. And of course, they took us all the way back. And that night, in front of everybody, they take our clothes off, and he strapped us really hard too. And I don't know how he made out, but I got an injury from that. And it's an injury that I still carry today. I think it turned me off from going to school. If that's what education is, then I don't want no part in it.
One of the things that I really struggled with all this time is shame. Shame of who I am, loss of identity. I didn't know who I was when I got out of there. I was ashamed of being a Native.
The effects of residential schools cannot be overstated. Survivors, their children, and grandchildren are all impacted by Canada's efforts to eradicate Indigenous cultures. The trauma inflicted by these schools, as well as the long history of poor treatment towards Indigenous communities, accounts for the lack of trust in settler forms of education that some Indigenous people have. The impact of residential schools is intergenerational, harming many people in the process. In addition to the unthinkable abuse, many survivors of residential schools were stripped of their languages and isolated from their cultures because of it, leaving traditional languages and valuable oral histories at risk. Generations of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations lives were lost, and the survivors were left with long-lasting trauma. It's clear to see why the path to reconciliation and healing is not simple. Racism against Indigenous communities did not end with the closing of the last residential school. Today, the minimal representation of Indigenous peoples in the media often perpetuates harmful stereotypes. These portrayals reduce their diverse cultures and individual experiences to a one-dimensional character or a mascot. These stereotypes dehumanize Indigenous people and ignore the history of trauma that has impacted these communities at the hands of the government, as well as the ongoing discrimination that they continue to face. We need to amplify the voices of Indigenous creators and activists to learn about their experiences and work to eradicate the biases which non-Indigenous people hold. One area where racism against Indigenous people is most evident is in the healthcare system. Joyce Echaquan, a 37-year-old mother from the Atikamekw Nation of Manawan, was seeking medical attention in a Quebec hospital in 2020. As she lay in her bed in pain, 2 hospital staff members were heard mocking her and making blatantly racist remarks. Joyce would pass away shortly after. A coroner's inquiry is currently underway with an expert witness testifying that her death could have been prevented if she'd been more closely monitored. This incident was recorded by Joyce on Facebook Live and gained media attention, but this raises the question: how many Indigenous patients suffer in silence without recorded evidence to back up their claims? How many healthcare employees, including speech-language pathologists, come to work with racist perspectives? An investigation of BC alone found that 84% of Indigenous respondents had experienced discrimination in the healthcare system. This is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed at a national level. You can do your part to combat stereotypes and change the way Indigenous people are represented by reviewing the language used in clinic resources and replacing materials that are outdated. Indigenous communities have always shown resilience, advocating for their rights, their identity, and the protection of their lands. With the use of social media, Indigenous advocacy has reached a broader scope of people than ever before. Through platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and more, Canadians who wouldn't have otherwise learned about Indigenous issues are able to benefit from this knowledge. Food insecurity, housing crises, and poor water quality are just some of the topics that Indigenous creators have been raising their voices for. The campaign to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals has also gained mass attention through social media. The RCMP reports 1,200 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, but accounting for unreported cases and testimonies from Indigenous communities, the actual number is estimated to be over 4,000. Indigenous women over the age of 15 are 3.5 times more likely to experience violence than non-Indigenous women. These atrocities cannot be separated from Canada's long history of sexualizing Indigenous women and creating policies that isolate them from safety networks and community resources. In June 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report that contained 231 calls for justice. As of right now, the government is in the process of working on an action plan, but no measures have been implemented yet. Despite the increasing enrollment of racially diverse students in speech-language pathology programs, it's no surprise that the field is predominantly white. This means that for many clinicians, there are going to be awkward moments and uncomfortable conversations coming to terms with what we don't know. But as speech therapists who serve diverse communities, it is our responsibility to do the work to unlearn misconceptions and biases. Particularly as non-Indigenous speech therapists, we have to be conscious of the history and have cultural awareness, and we must actively support Indigenous communities in the challenges that they're currently facing. Here are just a few ways that speech-language pathologists, healthcare workers, teachers, and more can be allies to Indigenous clients and communities. Get to know those around you. There are over 100 friendship centers in Canada that offer resources for Indigenous people living in urban areas. They also provide a space for non-Indigenous people to join and learn. Find your nearest friendship center and reach out to them to get involved with local initiatives and programs. Understand the history of colonialism in Canada as well as the ways it continues to impact Indigenous communities. We need to be patient with Indigenous clients and understand the context from which they might be coming to us. Take the time to build trust with Indigenous communities and ensure that your clinic is a safe space for clients to share their experiences and feel heard. Implement relevant vocabulary. Have a discussion with the client or their family about their unique preferences and the languages they use at home. If they express an interest, you can respectfully implement relevant terminology from their language, since there are often no perfect English equivalents for words in Indigenous languages. Expand your cultural competency. We mentioned earlier that the members of our clinic took the University of Alberta's 12-week course called Indigenous Canada. This resource is completely free for you to learn about the history of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada, as well as what it means to be Indigenous in modern times. Familiarize yourself with Jordan's Principle. In order to ensure that all Indigenous children in Canada have access to the healthcare they need, Jordan's Principle was established to prevent denials or delays in funding. Make sure you understand the principle and know how to support Indigenous clients in filing a claim. Be an advocate for your clients. This can look like providing information to your Indigenous clients about funding or alternative options for services, incorporating diverse learning styles and cultural sensitivity into their IEP, as well as the curriculum as a whole, and supporting clients so that they know how to self-advocate for their rights and needs. And finally, remain vigilant. With so many resources available on the internet and through social media, we can all do our part to stay informed by following Indigenous creators and advocacy groups and sharing what we learn with the public. We hope this video has inspired you to seek out more knowledge and to continue to be an ally to Indigenous peoples in your everyday life. We all have a responsibility to make our country a safer and more accepting place. We have a long way to go to reach reconciliation, but it starts with each of us. So share what you've learned with your friends, family, and colleagues, and challenge yourself to never stop learning.